Then, welcome everyone to the I guess now seasonal set review of the latest set of Magic. This one, of course, is Modern Horizons 2, which looks to like pretty seriously rock the boat on even a commander on a format as deep as Commander, which is no small feat. Definitely, this set is actually just Commander Masters memes going around again, and not without no reason. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. We're going to start with the white cards. Oh, just as a caveat, I won't be like deep diving on every single card. Some I might just cursorily touch on, and some I might just ignore altogether. And of course, I'm not looking at the reprint cards because those have already existed in the format. We don't need to talk about them. Okay, so starting with Abiding Grace. I don't love it. It is an interesting card that has a recurring effect for a couple of things. Returning target creature card with mana value 1 from your graveyard to the battlefield definitely could be good in a deck that is looking to like repeatedly sack its own creatures for value. But again, mana value 1 does put a pretty serious damper on what you actually do get to get back with this. So like, mana dorks are there, but again, I don't really know that this fits in a green-white deck. I'm thinking like Viscera Seer is like a pretty prime contender. Like you could just get a free scry every turn out of it. But again, we're talking kind of small ball stuff. I'd be willing to believe that this fits into some sort of an engine, but you'll have to show it to me before I am much of a believer, ultimately. And then the gain 1 life thing is like, again, if you got things that trigger off of like every time you gain a life, great, but otherwise it's like pretty small ball. Not loving it. Javelineer, obviously this is a modular throwback to, Acacian Javelineers, which I think is a fun design, and helps with this sort of red-white modular sub-theme that they have going in the set, but that's definitely very much a draft archetype. I do not believe that this card has anything to offer to Commander, realistically. Same with Arcbound Mouser. A lot of these cards are just limited plants, and that's a-okay with me. Let's see. Let's move on. What's the next like card that actually like excites me in terms of Commander? Break Ties is probably worth like briefly mentioning it, just because it is sort of a white version of the Return to Nature effect that's now kind of become evergreen in green. You're paying extra mana for it in exchange for like getting Reinforce, I guess, which is like not great, but it does give like an additional mode on this card essentially. But again, there are better things you could be doing. Okay, let's get to the first card that's actually like stirred up a lot of talk and buzz and controversy. Esper Sentinel, even just in one of the discords that I'm in, not my own. PS join the Discord. But yeah, we got into a fairly extensive discussion as to the merits of this card. So Esper Sentinel, one white for a 1/1 artifact creature human soldier. Whenever an opponent casts their first non-creature spell each turn, draw a card unless that creature's controller unless that card's controller pays X, where X is this card's power. So basically, at base, the first time your opponent casts a non-creature spell, they have to pay 1 mana. Otherwise, you get to draw a card. But that's only it only applies to the first card that they cast each turn, and only to non-creature spells. So at a glance, this could sort of best case scenario represent you drawing an extra 3 cards every turn cycle, where each of your opponents in succession plays a non-creature spell and then does not pay the 1, therefore allowing you to draw. So one of the obvious sort of comparisons here is Rhystic Study that I've seen made. Also similarly, Mystic Remora. While I believe that this card is good, and again, there's a bit of what's the word I'm looking for? Beggars can't be choosers kind of scenario going on in white with regards to their card draw and whatnot. I still think that this effect is being overblown, personally. It is one of the better versions of white card draw that we have so far, but I think that this is definitely one of those, like, this card is walking so that future cards may run. The way I see it, I don't think this card is it. But what it does do is it sets a very real precedent for what future white card draw looks like. I think the two major limitations are, first of all, the fact that it only triggers on non-creature spells, right? So you can play as many creatures as you want, no tax. So there are certain EDH decks that are just not going to care about this. And then also the first non-creature spell each turn rider, which is to say that it like, you know, if they can afford to just pay one extra, period, they get to play their turn completely uninhibited. Now, once in a while, you're going to draw a card, because sometimes they're just going to need all their mana, and they're not going to want to just pay one to deny you a card, and you're going to get a card. But a lot of the time, paying a 1 is pretty trivial. The reason that Rhystic Study is so good is because it taxes each and every single card that gets cast. Creature and non-creature, and all of them. And you may be able to pay for 1 or 2 of those Rhystic Study triggers. You're just, on a lot of turns, not paying for all of them. And that's where the value comes in. Because Rhystic Study almost guarantees cards are going to get drawn. And even then, sometimes you still don't. But it's, and so if Rhystic Study can go turns in a row without ever drawing a card, imagine how many turns you could go in a row with this being on the board for the same exchange. I'm not a fan of this card. I don't think it is unplayable. I think that if you have artifact synergies in your deck, and if you have ways of consistently making this thing bigger, then it gets more real. Because yeah, it is based on its power. So if you can even just put a sword of X and Y on this, your opponent's never paying 3 to deny you a card, so that's just going to get you a card if they want to cast a non-creature. And that's better. But now you're jumping through additional hoops yourself in order to make your opponent jump through one hoop. And so it just requires a lot of things to line up properly, which results in me sort of saying that this card is cool, and I think it's good, but it is not great. I think that I do like, though, what it signifies in terms of where white card draw is going in the future of Magic. I think that this is, like I said, this is a setup piece. This is sort of saying, okay, what if we do this, and then I'm looking forward to the more pushed version of this, you know, a year or two down the line, maybe sooner. Who knows? All right, moving on. Again, just going to kind of skip to the next cards that bear mentioning. I do think Healer's Flock is a hilarious card. Just literally 3 Healer's Hawks stapled together. Obviously, this the joke is that last year we had Llanowar Tribe, or 2 years ago now, we had Llanowar Tribe, which was 3 Llanowar Elves stapled together. Now we have 3 Healer's Hawks stapled together. It doesn't scale quite as well. Tapping for 3 green mana is a lot better than a random 3/3 lifelink for 3 white, but it's a fun design, and I enjoy the joke. Similar in terms of fun design, and I enjoy the joke, we have Late to Dinner, which is a reanimation spell that makes a food. And the flavor text is, I knew you were set in your ways, friend, but even I didn't expect you to keep our engagement under the circumstances. So literally, sorry I was late to dinner, I died. Big fan of it. Big fan of it. I don't... Sorry, and when I say it, I mean the flavor. I think this card's pretty bad. Like, a 4-mana reanimation spell is not new, even in white. And the flavor is great, but there are better versions of this effect. If you're really, really hard up for a white reanimation spell and you don't have black in your deck, you could do worse, but there are better versions. But anyway, moving on. Like I said, I had to acknowledge the flavor because it is great. Alright, a couple more over here to talk about. So we've got Nykthos Paragon, 6 mana, 4/6 enchantment creature, human soldier. I mean, this is a chunky card, no doubt about it. It's expensive. You're not just like, slamming this down every single game, but it has a very powerful ability. Now it says whenever you gain life, you may put that many 1/1 counters on each creature you control. Do this only once each turn. So do this only once each turn, again, I really do wish that a lot of these white cards didn't have that rider of you only get to do this thing once. I understand that if you had ways of repeatedly gaining life, you could just make your creatures arbitrarily large, but I don't know, I just don't think that's the most broken thing we need to be worrying about in this format. I also kind of wish this thing had lifelink, honestly, a 4/6 lifelink, because at least that way it kind of guarantees that if nothing else, you will gain 4 life this turn. And get to put 4 counters on your stuff. But that might have been too broken for Limited, and that's totally reasonable. In Limited, that might have been a beating. For a Commander, though, it's almost requisite, I feel like. I think it's a cool card, and again, the effect is a very strong effect. If you're the kind of deck that is gaining life in large chunks at a time, you know who you are, and this is probably going to be pretty good. If you're like, but just remember that it doesn't care how much life you're gaining, it only triggers one. So if you gained 1 life in your upkeep, you get to put 1/1 counter on all your creatures, right? But if you gain 1 life in your upkeep and then you like later gain 5 life that same turn, you're not going to get to put 5 counters on. So you really need to make sure that the first time you gain life is like the one that matters, because that's the only one you're going to get each turn. Now, notably, it does say each turn. So this can trigger on your opponent's turns as well if you have instant speed life gain. And that's a powerful effect as well. So yeah, role player in decks that care about gaining life. That's pretty much the be-all and end-all on this card. Yeah. Out of Time is another really interesting one. Some wonky mechanics going on here. So this is an enchantment for 3, 1 and 2 white. When it enters the battlefield, you untap all creatures, and then you phase them all out until Out of Time leaves the battlefield. Put a time counter on it for each creature phased out this way, and then it has Vanishing, which of course says at the beginning of your upkeep, remove a time counter, and then the last one that's removed sacrifices the enchantment, at which point all the creatures that were phased out would phase back in. So this is like a really strange riff on a Wrath effect that basically like locks down all the cards. So they're there, but they're not there for as long as Out of Time is there. Phasing kind of a wonky one. We've seen more and more phasing over the last couple of years. They're kind of bringing it back as like a pseudo mechanic. We saw it on Teferi Master of Time. We saw it brought back as the errata text for Oubliette. So lots of kind of versions of this going around. So this is just another one of them. I don't know how good this card is, honestly. It strikes me as not being particularly good. Because obviously your own creatures get locked down under this just as much as your opponents. Not to mention, it's kind of fragile. Like, your opponents could probably blow it up if they want to, and if they don't care, then they won't care. And it's like, I don't know, it puts too much of the... It puts too much power in your opponent's hands, in my opinion. I don't like Oblivion Ring effects in Commander, and this is sort of just like an even more dangerous one, where you're Oblivion Ringing the board, and then, but at any point your opponent can just bring, like, get rid of it and just bring their entire board back, right? And like, they could do it like right as they're about to, like right before their untap step, right at the on the end step of the person right before them, which means that they then get to have the first crack at like attacking the board with all these creatures that just came back again. I don't know. It seems very risky and very finicky. I'm open to someone doing something cool and splashy with this, but generally speaking, I'm not a big fan of this card. But it had to be mentioned because of just how kind of off the wall it is as a design, I think. And people will be playing this. I'm just not entirely sure how many tries it'll take before realizing it's bad and they kind of move on, is my suspicion. Yeah. Moving on to the next thing. Ooh, okay. So Resurgent Belief is another one that's really, really interesting to me. So this is a spell with no mana cost. It's got Suspend 2 for 1 and a white. And basically, when it comes off Suspend in 2 turns, return all enchantments from your graveyard to the battlefield. So this is Replenish with a 2-turn Suspend. So you basically get to cast it as early as the 4th turn, which makes sense because Replenish costs 4. But you know, you give up flexibility on the when in exchange for getting flexibility on your mana cost, basically. Which is, unsurprisingly for anyone newer to the game watching this, why I and a lot of other Magic streamers consistently mix up Suspend and Foretell, because they do very similar things. You pay a little bit up front to get a cheaper thing later. In this case, though, you pay nothing later, which is quite nice. The effect is a very powerful one. Replenish, I believe, is a reserveless card. And one way or the other, it's an expensive card with a very, very powerful mechanic, which is basically just, you know, reanimating multiple permanents that are difficult to reanimate, enchantments, all at once without paying any mana cost for that. So, like, you can get back a bunch of really dumb stuff for free if you've been casting, like, you know, sort of Windfall and Wheel of Time style effects, right? Putting a bunch of things into your graveyard, and then you kind of get them all back at once. You sort of, like, spend the next couple of turns after suspending this, putting things in your yard. Now what it does is it puts a huge bullseye on your yard, because normally if you're doing that kind of thing, people are just like, all right, that's weird, like whatever. But if they see this, then they know exactly what the plan is. So if anybody's got a Bojuka Bog, you better believe they're targeting you if you've got one of these on suspend. So, you're kind of giving up the element of surprise in exchange for getting a pretty steep discount on mana. So I would always play Replenish first, but to be fair, Replenish costs a lot of money right now. And so as a budget alternative to Replenish, you could do a lot worse. But if you are playing budgetless, then Replenish will be better. Now, you still might want a second copy. But if you're only trying to play one and you don't have a budget, Replenish will do you better than this. Still a cool card, though. Alright, Sanctifier on Vec is the definition of a Silver Bullet card. This is a modern card. Realistically, this is a modern plant. It's not to say that it's unplayable in EDH, but like it's so specific in like caring about red and black cards that like, well, you'll know if your metagame wants this or not, right? It either will or it won't, and that'll be that. But it is a cool card. But we're not going to spend too much time talking about it. Search the Premises, I think, is worth talking about. Actually, I want to talk about Scour the Desert for like 2 seconds, because I think this card is very bad, but like it's got really cool art. This art is really, really good. And like, I'm very sad that this really cool art is wasted on a kind of bad card. But yeah, everybody, let's appreciate Tyler Walpole's exquisite artwork on this card for a second. All right, moving on to Search the Premises. So Search the Premises, enchantment, 3 and a white. Whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, investigate. Generally speaking, I think that this is going to be fine in sort of low to mid power EDH decks. It is clunky, it is expensive, and it is a Rattlesnake card or a Pillow Fort card or whatever you want to call it. Like, it's not proactive, it's mostly just sort of vaguely disincentivizing your opponents from attacking you, but not in any meaningful way, which is leading me to believe that it's not great. But the flip side is that it's not a one or more trigger, which these kind of effects often can be. So every single creature that attacks you or a planeswalker will trigger Search the Premises independently, which could net you a whole pile of clues. Now, I don't know what you're going to do with like 5 clues if you get attacked by 5 things, because they still cost 2 each to sack and draw a card, but at least you didn't get nothing out of that. That being said, I don't know, it feels slow, it feels clunky, but I'm absolutely not going to count this kind of card out, because it is, again, another weird form of white card draw, and we're still at a point where white is starved enough for card draw that a card like this could make an impact. But I'm not anticipating seeing it in any sort of like, in any sort of more high power pods. And I'm not just speaking about CDH. I'm talking about like, I don't think it, like, again, if we want to use the admittedly very flawed deck ranking system, I think that this like caps out at like a 6 probably in terms of playability. 7 and 8 tier decks probably not playing this. But again, to take that with a grain of salt. This is, one man's opinion after all. Neat card, but I think it's too expensive. If this costs like 1 or 2, I think this could actually see a lot of play, because then you can kind of just slip it into your curve and it doesn't cost you that much to run it. 4 mana is a lot to ask from a card that does nothing on board and may do nothing for a while. Okay, next one is Sarah's Emissary, our first mythic rare. 7 mana, 7/7, so 4 and 3 white for a flyer. As Sarah's Emissary enters the battlefield, choose a card type. You and creatures you control have protection from the chosen card type. So this is a riff on, what is it, Valor's Reach Archon, I believe it's called, from Battlebond. Where basically, but this one is, so whereas that one was a symmetrical effect in green-white for 6, this is an asymmetrical effect in mono-white for 7. So you're giving up mana efficiency for lessening, like for increasing the number of decks you can play this in, and also making it, asymmetrical, which is not irrelevant, right? Notably, at base, this gives all of your creatures unblockable if you choose protection from creatures, which is not an unreasonable effect. It also just means that, creature-based abilities can't damage them. If they're going to have protection from your Flame Tongue Kabus and your Ravenous Chupacabras and your Inferno Titans and what have you. which is pretty cool. And like I said, it means that nobody can block you because you have protection from creatures. Instants can obviously also be relevant, right? Protecting your stuff against spot removal, things like that. Prot sorcery is probably going to be the least common mode, just because, you know, the main sorceries cast in Commander are Wraths and Draw Spells. And Draw Spells don't care about this, and Wraths also don't care about this. So I'm seeing Instants being a pretty popular one, Creatures being a pretty popular one, and then probably Planeswalkers, because again, Planeswalkers do tend to have a decent number of targeted abilities as well. But a cool card. Expensive, definitely a top-end type card, but a decent reanimator target, and you know, definitely will see play in the Commander format. Like, the effect is unique and powerful, even if it is a little clunky. What else do we have? Okay, we got contender for one of my favorite cards in the set. So of course, one of the biggest things that was hyped up and buzzed about for this set was, of course, the new pitch cast cycle. So there's a cycle of mythic rares, this of course being the first of those. Each of them is in one of the 5 colors, and they all have an enters the battlefield effect. They're all creatures with evoke, but rather than being a mana cost, the way evoke has been historically, they essentially work similar to Force of Will. So you exile a card that shares a color with it, and then get that effect immediately, but then you're required to sack the card. So you don't get to keep the creature if you evoke it, but you do still get the ETB ability, and you get it for 0 mana, which is of course very powerful in some situations. So here we have a 5 mana flash lifelink 3/2. So a 3/2 for 5, obviously not a particularly good rate, but flash and lifelink both matter. But of course the big deal here is the ETB ability, which is exile up to one other target creature, sorry. That creature's controller gains life equal to its power. And so, of course, that is, you know, a direct reference to Swords to Plowshares, which is, you know, probably just the best white card ever printed, full stop. Definitely the best removal spell ever printed. Yeah, this card is incredible. And of course, the fact is that this card works really, really, really well with any sort of blink synergies, which white is, you know, definitely very situated in, right? Your ephemerates... Ephemerate being the card whose stock has risen probably the most from these cards existing, because being able to go turn 1, evoke... Well, this one is less relevant on turn 1, because your opponent's not likely to have a hugely problematic card on turn 1. They might in Modern, but less so in EDH. But the ability to go 0 mana, evoke this creature, and then for 1 mana, ephemerate it, thereby blinking it and returning it, getting a second ETB trigger, and bypassing the evoke, because, of course, evoke only triggers off of the original card. If you blink it out, the game doesn't actually see that card itself was evoked. It was another version of it that was. So you're basically fizzling the evoke trigger and getting an extra ETB trigger all in the process, which is a lot of value for a single white mana, although you do need to use 3 cards total to accomplish that, right? This card, the ephemerate, and then whatever it is, other white card that you pitch to this. But the bottom line is this card has a lot of value for a potentially very low cost. I think that this is going to be a mainstay of Commander pretty much from now until forever. I think this is an instant staple in white. And I'm very much looking forward to getting my hands on 1 or 2 of these. Moving on, we have, I think our last, maybe not. Yeah, our last white card that we're going to talk about for this review, because the other cards below this are reprints. We're going to ignore those, of course. But our last one is Timeless Dragon, which is a card that I find very interesting, not because I think it's extremely powerful, but because I think it's extremely versatile. So a 5 mana 5/5 for 5/5 flyer for 5 is a very reasonable rate, especially in mono white. Like that's just a good rate. It also has plane cycling for 2 generic, which is of course discard this card, and whereas regular cycling is just draw a card, this one is actually discard this card, search your library for, in this case, a planes. Reveal it, put it in your hand. Notably, it is a plains and not a basic plain, so you can go get dual lands with this, right? Your tundras, your sacred foundries, your whatever the hell it is you're looking for. So this actually does work even in a non-mono white deck, which I find is quite good. And then it of course has Eternalize, right? So you've plain cycled this; it's now in your graveyard. But it still has a little bit left to give, right? So instead of getting a 5/5 flyer for 5, you're getting a 4/4 flyer for 4, in the form of the Eternalized Timeless Dragon. So you're just getting like a lot of value from this at like every point in the game, because it's either a 5/5 flyer that dies and then later gives you a 4/4 flyer, or it's fixing your mana early on and then coming back as a 4/4 flyer later without costing you additional cards. I don't think this card is powerful, but it is a card that feeds a lot of synergy and versatility engines. And I do honestly think that this card will be a card that sees play in Commander because of that. I'm a big fan of this card. Obviously a very cool throwback also to Eternal Dragon, which is, you know, the card that it's riffing off of. Which I don't think has been playable in Commander for a long time, so this is kind of nice to give it like a new playable coat of paint. Alright, so the rest of the white cards are reprints. We're not going to worry about those.